My name is Wes Preston, and I'll tell you a little bit about myself in a second. You probably read that on your way here. You don't need to read it again. We're going to talk about some examples, some client-side rendering, what it means, why we're talking about it. Again, my name is Wes. I'm a SharePoint MVP. I'm an independent consultant out of the US, if you couldn't tell from my accent or lack thereof, depending on your perspective. The one URL up there that I want you to write down or get from the presentation later is the idubbbs.com/blog. And I'll show you why here in a few minutes. I'll switch over and you can see the content that I've got out there. So my background is I got into the SharePoint world as an IT pro. Before I was in the SharePoint world, I was a developer. Since I've been in the SharePoint world, about 7-8 years, I can't remember now, I've kind of rolled out of the IT pro and more into working with the business to help them implement solutions. So talking to folks, figuring out what they're trying to do, and then telling them whether or not it should be in SharePoint, and if it should be, kind of giving them a direction to go. The reason I'm giving you that background is I'm hoping that'll help you a little bit when I'm walking through here to show you what perspective I'm coming from. The reason we're doing this in the power user track or the IW track is because I'm one of those guys that fits into that gray area of I'm a power user, but I recognize and can tweak/hack some of the code. And for those of us in that category, we get a little frustrated with views. There's a lot of power there, but at the same time, it's always, I wish I could do just this little bit more. So that's one of the tools that Microsoft gave us when they introduced JS Link in 2013 and in Office 365. So we're going to walk through what that means. Overview of what we're doing. I will give you the 2-cent tour of how JS Link works and how CSR works within SharePoint, but I'm not going to go into it in too many details. That's what a lot of the other, or not a lot, but the other two folks already did. If you weren't in those other two sessions, I've got them listed at the end, so they're going to be good references for you to go check out for additional details if you kind of want to round out your CSR and JS Link experience. But why do we want to talk about client-side rendering? Part of it, I already mentioned, was because the way that, or the tools that we get with views, and I'll give you another little sideline too, is that my approach to a lot of things within SharePoint is to use out of the box as much as possible. In fact, what the last gentleman in here was saying is use it out of the box, don't go custom without knowing what you're doing and having a plan for it. I subscribe to that same role. It doesn't mean not to use customization. It just means let's use the tool that was built for us and then extend it where appropriate. CSR, in my opinion, fits right into that category. You're going to spend a bunch of your time still building lists and libraries and apps and whatever the latest term is going to be for it. And you're going to spend a lot of time building views because you can do a lot of really cool things with views, even with calculated fields and such. We're just nudging it just a little bit further. So it's helping with the user experience, and it's giving us, the power users, a little bit more control over what we can get into those views. Some of the reasons that we have to talk about it is because of what changed with SharePoint Designer in the last iteration, with them taking away the design view. So some of the things that we're doing here with code, unfortunately, we used to be able to do in SharePoint Designer. Highlight it, right-click, format, you were done. We lost that, so that was a bit frustrating. But this is another way to fill some of those gaps. The other change, this isn't necessarily a good or bad thing, but a change that happened with the way that SharePoint is being given to us by Microsoft is cloud first. So with that, it's a lot harder, or in some cases impossible, to be able to roll out code to make some of these changes that we would have done in the past. So the change with CSR, with client-side rendering, using JS Link, we have the ability to do this all within the browser. So it's no longer managed code, but it's something that we can implement even on Office 365. So client-side rendering and JS Link are going to work across the platform 2013 and Office 365. Things to note with client-side rendering, we are not changing the data. So at the end of the day, you've got a list, library, app, whatever you want to call it. You've got columns and rows and the data that's in there. We are not changing what's in those rows. Technical aside is, yes, you could hack stuff if you wanted to, but that is not the general path that people use. We're just changing the way that you're presenting it, okay? And we're going to show you plenty of examples of that. Other little notes, again, I don't want to get too deep into the details here, but we are using, the nice thing about JS Link is that we're using the same thing that Microsoft is using to display it. We're just extending it. So it might feel like you're hacking it a little bit, and you are, but you're kind of hacking within the rules that they've given us. So in 2010 and before, you could put code on the page, you could do some things behind the scenes, and there wasn't really a legal way to do it. They gave us a legal way, and that's what we're talking about. JS Link property on Webparts or app parts is that legal way, and we'll show you what that looks like. But at the end of the day, we are talking about code. So if you're a power user, some people go, we're done. You know, we don't want to talk about code. We don't want to see semicolons, blah, blah. But we are talking about code. What I'm trying to do here is, again, help you extend your tool set. So I've got 10 or 12 different templates that you can use to start from, and I'm going to show you a little bit about how to use those. This is one example that someone showed me yesterday, which is kind of neat. This is a public-facing SharePoint site where they've used client-side rendering on the page. What you've basically got here is you've got a list view. So you see the columns, you see your rows, but they used CSR to go in there and tweak the way that these links are set up. So this is one of the examples that I'm going to have a template for you. You're essentially still putting out your title, but you're now inserting links into those titles, and you're controlling where they're going. So this particular site, and you can just go up, jump on there and go look at it, we're creating links that are going to go to filter views of other lists, which everything, we already know that, most of you guys have played with it already, is that everything in SharePoint is you can get to via URL. Well, if we can go to a list and we can filter it, you can look at the URL and say, hey, I'm already filtered on this ID. Well, if you use that same string manipulation, you can build those into your view and jump straight to those filters. All of a sudden, our tool set for building dashboards gets a lot more powerful. So that's not something that we can do with, you can do some of that with connected web parts, but not with this degree of control. So we'll show you a little bit about how that works. Has anyone been to that site? All right. So the basics. You still need to have a list or library or app, whatever we're calling it. You still need to have a view. Bleeker was talking earlier today about doing things with forms. So you can also edit forms if you want to. We're not going to cover that here. But we're talking about just views. So if you're in list views and page views, I'm a big fan of creating a page and then putting a view on there instead of going to the list and actually editing those pages, which technically you can do, but might be confusing for your users. So you can do it. You'll have to decide whether or not it fits your use case. I've found that the solution that we've been using, my team has been using a lot lately, is we're still stitching a lot of things together, but we're also using out-of-the-box lists as much as we can. We might tweak the way that those lists work. We're using things like promoted links, web parts, and we're stitching multiple pages together to get a full solution. If we need to extend it past that, we're building custom forms with JavaScript, just because there's not a good forms solution anymore. But backing up to this, we've got our app and a view for it. I'm gonna oversimplify this. Everything in here can be done in different ways, and I know that Martin and Todd have talked about this in different ways. But for an information worker, a great place to start is just create a document library, call it scripts. That's where we're going to put all of our code. We're going to have different files for each of our overrides. You're going to have a JavaScript file. I'm going to give you a bunch of templates to be able to do that. And you're going to set the JS Link property. So if you have your web part on the page, I'm going to switch back and forth between web part and app part because I've been doing this for too long. So if you go to your web part, you've got your view, edit the properties, at the very bottom, under miscellaneous, is JS Link. And there's a number of things that you can put in there. If you have a scripts library, it can look like the link that I have at the bottom, okay? But like I said, Martin had some a couple of slides on talking about all the different options you can have. This is just the one that we're going to get you working on the basics first. You can, if you want, have multiple files. So if you wanted to have one override for a header and another override for one field and another override for another field, you can have 3 different files and list them all in that JS link if you want to. We're sticking with one. Has everyone seen this before? Folks that have not done this yet? Okay. So those are the basics. I have a couple slides in here that will make a lot more sense once we've seen some of the demos, but I'm just going to talk to them at a high level, and again, you'll fill in the gaps. There aren't a lot of best practices. There's literally like 5 to 10 of us that are doing this and talking about this in the community. That's not enough to say that there's best practices out there. So we've got good practices. We've got things that we've done. We found things that work and that don't work. Things like using a scripts library, right? Someone might want to use a library and hide it from the user interface. There are lots of variations on a theme. These are things that you can work on with your IT department. Because we're working with code, you should at some point be touching base with the developers in your organization so that 1, they know what you're doing, and 2, you're able to leverage them from time to time. At the end of the day, we're trying to save them time and effort. They've got bigger and badder projects to work on. If we're just tweaking the way that a view looks, it's not something we necessarily want to use those resources for because they're pretty valuable guys. So where to store your scripts, when to engage developers. Again, we want to kind of fill in that little gray space between power users and developers. We don't want to start trudging forward and making more and more complex things. We need to be integrating with those folks. So things to do. If your organization is large enough where there's more than one of you that are doing CSR and JavaScript, you should probably have some governance on it in terms of, what types of templates are we using? Where are we putting the files? How are we versioning the files? Just things that we want to make sure that we're doing something in an organized way rather than everyone's kind of doing their own cowboy stuff. Good enough? A couple of troubleshooting notes. One of the things that happens is if you're writing poor JavaScript, now I don't want to scare the folks that aren't coders, but if for some reason you've got an override that's working, you've got fields that are bolded or highlighted or whatever you have, you make a change and save it and come back to that page and it looks like it did before you started anything. That doesn't mean you broke everything. It just means that the JavaScript file itself stopped working. So it kind of just goes, oh, doesn't work. I'm going to ignore that. So you need to go back and look at it and see where you broke something. I like to use the JavaScript alert just to make sure I've got all my pieces in place. Put your file out there, make it extremely simple, have the alert turned on, put your link in the JS link, go to the page and see if that alert comes up. If it doesn't come up, you're not working yet. So get that piece working. Now you can, once you have that in place, comment out your alert and start working on your overrides. Column names. These are SharePoint's internal column names. So if you go out there and say, if you have a title or a category or things like that, some of that, we've all been trained to use a single word, no spaces. And then if I want to go back in and change it, that's fine because the internal name stays the same. You still need to use that internal name, and you'll see where, I'll point it out, when you're saying which fields that you want to override. Some of these are confusing. You can even start with one with no spaces, and SharePoint might go, that's a special word for me, so I'm going to change it. So you still need to go look at those internal names to see if they work. Minimal download strategy. This is something where there is a workaround for CSR working with MDS. However, you can run into issues with it. So the easiest way to get it to work is to just turn that feature off on your site. That's the easy way out. The right way, if you're making some bigger solutions, is to there's a couple of things that you need to build in. I have a link to it at the end of my presentation that you can build into your script so that you can still have MDS turned on, but your script will still work. So something to keep in mind.
Excuse me, sorry. So
yep.
There are a few issues if you do that. What issues?
Well, the override might not work. You might hit reload like 5 times. It'll work once. It won't work. I mean, it gets really glitchy.
Okay. Secondly, how big a difference does it make having MDS turned on or off? Is it actually noticeable or is it?
That's a debate beyond my level. There are basically, once you start building larger sites or data that changes more rapidly, or you're pulling in data from other sites, it can make a big difference. I would say in a day-to-day, if you're just spinning up a website, you're using it for collaboration, it's really not that big of a deal. It's going to save you if you're in a mobile environment and things like that, but day-to-day on an intranet, you're really not going to see any difference, I don't think. So, Another thing to keep in mind or to try right away is to start with a single app part on a page. Some of the things that we're implementing with CSR can potentially affect multiple web parts. So one of the things that we did a lot in 2010 and before was if I wanted to organize my page a little bit, I would, instead of having a single large list that might be grouped by or filtered in a certain way, I might put 3, 4, or 5 different web parts on the same page that are all looking at the same list, but filtered differently. So maybe different categories or content types. It gives me a lot of options and a lot of flexibility. So, but those 5 web parts are gonna have some, if not all, of their fields or columns being the same. If I write an override for my page and I say override this field, it's gonna do it on all of them. You have, again, we're not gonna talk about it in this session, you have the option of targeting though. You can just, again, it takes a little bit more code, where you can say, if I'm in this web part and you have the web part ID for it, only use the override in that web part. But by default, with the simple stuff that we're doing, it's going to override all of them. And I've got a couple of examples that are very specific to that. Other questions before I move on? Holy cow. All right. This is going to go fast. All right. Yeah. Well, I don't know, if you talk to other developers, what always happens is that you show up and you go, oh, it'd be really cool if I just added this little piece. And then like 10 hours later, you've added, a ton more content that probably isn't as polished as it should be. But anyways, so I've got a bunch of demos and I've got a bunch of templates, some of which I added 2 hours ago. So I'll get through as many of these demos as I can. Please ask questions as we go through them. And if whatever we don't get through, again, I've got the templates out there for you, so you'll be able to pull them down. And if I don't already have a blog post about that specific template, I will in the next week or two. All right. List column content. This is probably the most common thing you're going to do. This is where I just want to go in and I want to make something bold, change the formatting, use some HTML to go in there and play with it a little bit. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy. I just want to tweak the functionality. I don't necessarily want to rewrite some custom stuff. One thing to note, and the first template that I have out there right now is just dealing with text columns, because those are the easiest ones to deal with. Once you get beyond that, things get a little dicey. Numbers, also easy. But if you start getting into things like lookups, if I've got one list and it's got a column or two in it that are lookups to other lists, it traditionally looks like a link, right? So you can click on that link and go to that list, which in many of the cases that I use is completely useless. I don't want them going over there. I just want it to be a drop-down that they can choose from and show the value. So one of the first things on my list to go do after this, because I've already done it, I just don't have the template written up, is to show how you can write an override that just takes that link out of there. So now I can see the value. I can still change the value just like I can in any other list, but it's not going to show up like a link anymore. They're little utility things that just make the UI better. The reason I spend a lot of time on this is because the main client that I work with, they are not the most forward company in the world, so they're very comfortable with web interfaces, but they're not very comfortable with SharePoint interfaces. We've got a SharePoint team, we've got people that use it for collaboration, but most of the users they're not SharePoint people. They see a web page, they don't go, oh, this is SharePoint. I click on the 3 dots to get my menu and blah, blah, blah. They see a list and go, what do I do? So we're trying to make that experience easier for them. All right, so go ahead.
One quick thing, dates. In America, they probably don't have the problem.
Oh, I'm sure we do.
No, in the UK, it assumes the date is American format.
Oh, then you're right, that's your problem.
And but it's not just, it says that's a valid date. It goes, oh, you said the 19th month. Well, you actually mean next year and the 7th month.
Oh.
So can we have a blog post on that one sometime? Because
if you remind me afterwards, I will look at that.
Solved it yet.
So you can certainly there's probably a way that we can twist that around and make it,
Yeah.
That's actually a great use case. Remind me after we're done though, so I can write it down. I could tell you may have some passion around that area. All right, so this is the quick example, right? I'm just going to override a column. Really cool list, one column called title. Yay. I've got 3 different examples or 3 different templates that we're going to show you. One is called inline. So rather than talking about it, let me just show it to you. So those are some examples of things that you can do. I haven't done anything with styling in terms of using a style sheet or whatever. I'm overriding the title content with the title content with a HTML wrapper around it. That's all we're doing. So let's see how well I do here. So these are the templates that you'll be able to see. So one thing I didn't mention yet is, ironically, SharePoint Designer took this feature away from us, but I found it to be pretty useful for actually editing the CSR files. Once I've got them in scripts, interesting. Once I have them in a scripts library, I can just go out to the library and make my changes. And it's really, really easy to just hit save and then flip back over to the browser and hit refresh. So SharePoint Designer is still a handy tool in some cases. So what you're seeing here is, let's see if I can get over to the right page too. All right, text formatting. Good. All right. So if I'm in here, I'm looking at I've got a bunch of different examples just with HTML. This is the one that's actually active right now. I have a clean version of this too, so you basically are seeing just the code that you need, and then you can build from there. You're probably going to see a combination of simple code and then code that's commented so that you can get all the value out of that as well. But if I wanted to go in here, I could comment out the bold, and I could say, let's do the, whoops. Yeah. There we go. Let's do the strike through, because I think that's pretty cool. Save it. Oh, come on. Am I looking at the right file? Probably not. So let's go see. Has everyone here done CSR? Anyone here not done it? All right, good. So that gives me an excuse to go show it to you. All right, so I'm on the page. I'm editing it. Again, this is not the list page. This is a separate page in my site because I don't want to mess up my users. There we go. That's because I'm using multiple. All right. So if I use the inline one, can you see that okay? Kind of small. Sorry about that. There's my scratch through. So I had 4 different files that are similar to this, and I'll show you why in a second. So again, it's very easy for me to go back in here, say, all right, that one's cool. Let's try superscript and subscript are terrible examples because they look bad. Let's use emphasis or italics. So again, let's hit change, jump over, italics. Yay. All right, so you can see that it's that quick. It's pretty easy to do. The differences between these other files that you saw, the inline string array and multiple, let's jump back over there. Oh, let's go back to that one for a second. What I want to show you, come on. It's thinking real hard, which is why I put them over here as well. All right. So in here, you basically can get away with having just that. So that's a single item. This is where all the guts is, or where all the guts are. Here's the name of your field. It's the internal name. Here's the value of of that field, and I wrap the HTML around it. Okay. This is what I'm referring to as inline because I'm basically doing it right here as part of the override. So this is the field override. If I jump out and I look at I've got array and I've got string. There it is. So this one, I'm calling a function, and I'm doing the HTML or the building of that string down here. So that's another way that you can do it. So if you're just doing a simple wrapper of HTML, you can do it in line really easily. But if you want to do something a little bit more complex, maybe build a couple of values into one, this is where you could potentially do the date flipping stuff if you want to display it a different way. So this is another one. This is where you'd basically use it if you want to do it a little bit more code. What I recommend, and I didn't give you the disclaimer at the very beginning, I am not a JavaScript expert. So don't go, why are you doing that? Because I don't know any better until someone tells me. But the way that I've been doing most of mine now is by doing an array build. So this way I can basically just go in there and say, I'm going to add an element. I'm building my string, but I'm doing it in a way that's a little bit easier to read and a little bit easier to edit. If I just have a string that says this plus this plus this plus this plus this, it gets a little bit hard once that string gets longer. If I want to do it this way, I can basically pull all my elements together and use JavaScript to scrunch them together and kick it out. Todd Bleeker, yeah.
He covered the same thing this morning.
Did he?
Making a really long HTML, and he came up with a really good way of doing it.
I'll have to go.
I like the array idea, but you're still putting strings in.
Yep.
And he did a really good way of doing it, which is basically just create the objects.
Yep.
And then use the outer HTML property to generate the HTML string.
Even better.
Great way of doing it.
Yep.
I was really impressed with that.
For those of us that aren't good at HTML, it's quite good.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
He is.
This requires you to know that the HTML. I mean, I know people who know JavaScript normally know HTML.
Right.
But it gets you to get the right, to do spans and things like that.
Yep.
And not get the, I forgot to close that tag or whatever.
Yep. So I'm sure whatever Todd showed you is awesome because he is amazing. Did you walk out of his session with a higher blood pressure than you did walking in? Because I can't even have a conversation with that guy without being just jazzed after talking to him. We're from the same place in the States, and I only ever see him outside of there. So it's kind of funny, but super guy. So that's one way. I'll have to go look at Todd's way. All right. Does that make sense to everybody? So a couple different ways of doing it. What do we have, till 5:15? Yeah? Or whenever. Yeah.
The trains don't get any better. Or any going low. They're already busy now.
All right. So we're going to go through a couple more utilities, and I think we'll be okay for time here. So this is another one where you can change the header text. So you've got your view. It comes with those headers. Well, if you've kind of grown up like me and are kind of data-centric, you might build your list in a way where those field names aren't necessarily intuitive or helpful to users or as nice as they could be. So this gives us the ability to go in there and override my list or my view and give them nicer titles. Again, we're not, this isn't rocket science, but we're just showing you some other ways to override things. This is a little bit different because you're not using the name now, you're using the order in the view to get to it, and I'll show you here what that means. I'm going out there and reaching out and saying, all right, field 0, field 1, field 2. Generally, you're going to end up going out there and playing with it, and if you change your view, you might have to tweak it again. So you have to kind of pay attention to what you're doing there a little bit. But again, it's not that hard. You can literally take this same code and copy and paste it. That's why I'm showing you these things as templates. And it's called columnheader.js. You can see down here, I'm not even going to jump over to that one. I've got new name was the name of a different field, type of document instead of document type. I mean, it's really just little things, right? But at the end of the day, if your business users are thrilled because it says that differently, then you just won.
Can you use that same technique to change the ellipsis, the 3 dots, into something that makes sense?
In terms of, I haven't done the ellipsis yet. What I have been doing in that case is basically changing that field so I'm not using the one that has the ellipsis on it, and I'm making links. So and that's actually one of the examples we'll look at.
Right.
So that's one way you can do it. You could, because it's HTML, you could drop a button on there if you want to. Both, links and buttons are both a heck of a lot more intuitive to users than the ellipsis. Right. Did you have a question back there? Okay. No, it's fine. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't skipping past you. Keep talking. So that's a pretty easy one. Again, there's the example. I'm not going to jump into that one because this is pretty much it. All right. This one I like. Again, very simple. but useful. So this is one where if we were building out a dashboard and you've got 3, 4, 5 different web parts on there, and one of them's empty, it still comes up with that standard, there are no items to show in this blah, 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 right? Not the greatest user experience. So we can write an override where we can put whatever text we want in there. So if I'm building out a dashboard and I've got one of my web parts is empty, I can say, hey, you don't have any tasks assigned, or hey, you don't have any of these things to do whatever you need to do with them. Again, not super complicated, but the user experience is good. The one thing to note here is that unless you're targeting your web part and you've got 5 web parts on there, this override will by default write over them all. So now I've got 5 web parts and they all say you don't have this to approve. So you probably need to make it a little bit more specific. But it's a pretty slick one. I was also trying to figure out how I can put a link in there. You can't do it that easily, but I'm going to see if I can't find a way to do it. Because I would love for it to say, there aren't any of these here, click here to start a new process. Which isn't a big deal if you're just in a list and you already have the new buttons. But what if this list is kind of 3 or 4 steps down the line and I want to hit new and jump over to start the process over? Then that button would be pretty cool. So something to take a look at. It's on my list. All right, covered that. Any questions there? Anyone going to use that one? Yeah, cool. Hiding columns. Ways to mess with your users. All right, so this is another utility one. So there are some cases where maybe you're doing a calculated field, or you might be using those fields for generating content in these views, but you don't actually want you don't actually want that column displayed. So this way, this is an option where you can go out there and hide it without doing other things that you maybe shouldn't be doing. Again, this is another one that could potentially affect all your web parts. So if you're hiding a column and then all of a sudden columns on your other lists start dropping off, good place to look at this one and make sure you've got the targeting going on. And I don't have a screenshot because that would be here's a web part with nothing on it. But I'll show you the example here in a sec. So this is also using jQuery. So I just posted a post yesterday on how to add jQuery to your site for IT pros. So if you're not already a developer and already using jQuery and have it implemented on your farm, there's an easy way to do it. From an IT pro, I said IT pro. From an IW perspective, from a power user perspective, we don't want to deal with this. This is nastiness. All I want to be able to do is say, I want to play with the field number. And that will help me get rid of it. Okay, so my template will be, put your number in there. Check your view. Did it go away? Change your number. That way you can see, until you kind of creep out and figure out which field you're dealing with, that'll work. So I've got all 3 of my fields out there now. And of course, my console is being weird, so I can't even get over there. So I've got, let's call it 3 columns, because I've got the checkbox, the title, and modified. Boom, gone. So one thing that if you're digging into this at all, the one thing to note is that one of those is the header, or you're replacing, or you're affecting 2 different things. You're affecting the header and telling it to hide, and you're affecting the column. So that's why there's 2 elements that you're playing with in there. That's why you have to put 2 numbers in. If you really wanted to mess with somebody, you could hide 1 header and 1 column. Like I said, this is a great way to mess with your users. All right, but you can see how easy that was. That's 1 line of code in there. All right, we did the empty web part. Let's jump over to links to forms, custom links, whatever you want to call them. As I mentioned, this is something where you're building a link. So right now we've got 3 forms that are default whenever you create a list. You've got the display form, new form, and edit form. You might create new ones. You might edit those forms. You might build a custom form. But you want to be able to get to those forms, and we're basically going to build that link out. And there's a couple of different things that are nice about it. One is that you're controlling where it's going, because you might still want to keep the default new and edit forms available to folks, but you also might want to have special ones. So if I'm a manager, I might want to have an edit form that shows more fields than it does for a default user, things like that. So I might have more forms. This is going to give me a way to get to those a little bit easier in the user interface. It's also more web-like, as we mentioned, so we don't have to remember the ellipsis or the right column that goes to one thing and not the other. And again, in that other use case where I'm building full solutions with multiple pages and JavaScript forms and such, it's giving me all that control that I need to build the forms, build the links that I need to go where I want them to go. So this is one example, and it's a takeoff of one that I'm using with the client I have right now. So I actually have the ellipses on there at the same time. I could just as easily take those off and only display the fields that I want. I also have that stupid lookup link on there on this view as well. So that's, like I said, next on my list to get an example for. But I've built out a string where I can have an edit and a details link that's a lot more intuitive to users. Okay, they don't have to worry about the SharePoint header and all that fun stuff. Customlinks.js. Let's jump over there and look at it real quick. All we're doing is building the script. Yes, I called it the wrong thing. I have to change that. Oh yeah, the other thing that's fun here is that I can also control the source. I can control where the form is going to, that's the problem. It's rolling to the bottom because this is inclined. All right, so I am going to control. I have to build. You have to do a little bit more building here because you're building out an A link. So I've got, where's my link going to go? I'm grabbing that ID so that link is unique to that item because that's in there. And I'll comment this a little bit better when the template is out there. But this is also very useful for us when we're building out those solutions, is the source. By default, if I was to do this without the source, they would hit save or cancel, and it would jump back to that list view, not the page that I'm actually using to run that. So again, these are really simple things, but it's a heck of a lot easier for your users. So then I basically had the second thing, that this is for I called it details, but it's the display form. Something else that we'll get a little bit more detail on too is that this is explicitly going to the display form. There is some code that's available. I don't have it in this session, but there's some code available where you can basically tell SharePoint to go to the current display form, because you can say set this form as the default. It will say, hey, what's the default display form? Hey, what's the default edit form? And you can use that rather than being more explicit. You can also be explicit this way. So lots of options, but again, it's not too bad for what you're building out, and hopefully you'll be able to take that template and build it out yourself. The only thing that gets dicey or a little bit irritating is making sure you've got the references the right way. So it might take you a couple tries there. If you use this template, you would replace your internal name of that field where you're putting it, and then you would have to, if you just did this and got it to display on your form, that would be one step. Now you've got your JS link working. Then you would go back in and hover over that link and say, is this going the right place? Let me make my changes, hit save, iterate a couple of times until you got it working the way you want it to. But again, it's pretty straightforward. You won't have to worry about building that in. ID is always part of a list.
I just checked something a second.
Yeah.
That source props that you're putting in there in the query string, is that the source of the page that you are currently in?
No, this is the source is a property, is that the right word, of a link, where it basically says, after I'm done with this form that I'm on, where do I go next?
Right.
So that's what source is.
It's a really, really useful. I use it on navigation lots.
Okay.
So when somebody's filled in a form, I have a thank you page.
Right.
And
Perfect.
I just use the source,
Okay.
and it's a really nice, easy thing that makes them think an application's been written.
Exactly. Great use case. All right. So that's that one. Any questions there? All right.
Sorry, did that put that into a new column?
It put it into a, good question. Let me jump back there. Where was it? It put it into a column that I created, just called, what was it, the CSR or something. And I called it that because this is another blog post waiting to be written. If you create one and you call it CSR1, it puts some funky characters in there, in that field name. I have no idea why. So it must be using it internally somewhere, which is scary. But yes, so you can either use an existing column to overwrite and put your text in, or you can create one explicitly and say, all right, I know I'm going to need a field to do things in. So I create one that's the easy way to do it, which is what I did for these examples. I've found pretty quickly that if I pick a notes field or something, that I know I can already put content into, it's just a matter of time before someone goes, hey, can you put the notes field on here? And then I don't have a column anymore. So it's easier to do it up front. There are ways, I believe, and I haven't gotten that far yet, to create a column on the fly so that you're creating a column in the display that's not in the list itself. That would be the best way to do it from a data perspective. So once I get to that point, I'll definitely post on that one as well. Great question. All right, item override. So what I've been doing up till now is overriding individual columns or fields. If you want to be able to do the whole thing, you're going to do an item override. Where you've seen this in the past is when we had those announcements lists, and you say, show me the item on the announcements list. It was this cool summary view, right, that had, here's the person that wrote it, the date they wrote it, and then the content underneath it. That wasn't like rows and columns. That was like a really nice way to display stuff. That's an item override. So the cool thing is that you get a ton more control. You can explicitly build that thing out however you want. You can put graphics in there. You can use tables, all the HTML and JavaScript that you love. It just takes more work because you're essentially rewriting how that whole thing is displayed now. And I'll show you an example here. Actually, a couple of examples. So my item, the demo template I have out there will do this for you right now, which is I replaced my header. I replaced the columns and the drop-down stuff in the columns with some text. And then I wrote each item out. And I put it, this isn't even in a list. This is just basically row, row, row. Where I found this to be really nice is if you have a view on a page that you know is going to be a small amount, using this method takes up a lot less space, almost like 2/3 of what it would if you had it in that list format. So it just looks a lot smaller and cleaner. And if you wrap list, like the unordered list tag around it, it even looks cooler if you ask me. It depends on your use case, but if you've got a page that's maybe listing, hey, here are the 5 members of my team, you can do it something like this rather than in a table Excel format on your homepage. So it's just another way to do it, but it looks pretty clean. This is another one where we didn't get really crazy about the content we were putting in it, but we rebuilt the title field essentially by saying, all right, here's the title of the item I want to go to, here's the date and the time for it, and I can click on it and go to my custom form. So I rewrote that item. Again, it's a lot tighter than a list view would be. You could certainly write it out and have it more tabular if you really wanted to. This is another view that looks a little bit more like a summary view. You can have it in kind of paragraph format, or digest form, I guess is the right term. There's a lot of things you can do, but let's jump into that code real quick so you can see it. I'm going to go fast because I want to get to the group by. Does anyone else hate the group by headers? Yes? What was that? So that is the one. That's why I was in a rush, because I really wanted to get to the group by template before I got in here. All right, so we are doing, again, now instead of doing the field override, we're doing an item override, okay? And again, now I'm just built, this time, this is why it's good to use either Todd's format or this one, using something that's has a little bit more control when you're building that that string, because once you start getting into item overrides, you're building more text. This is a bad example because I'm only showing very little, but if you wanted to build that whole summary view out, you would do it in here. But again, pretty simple, straightforward. You're dealing with the items that you already have in your list, so you're still building a view with the components that you need to build that item out with. So I've got an ID, I've got a title. When I have my list and I'm building the view out, I still have to include the columns that I want to include in this part in order for the code to see that data. Does that make sense? But again, pretty straightforward. I built my string out, and now it's going to jump out to the page. There's that custom links. So there's my item override. If I take that off of there, it's just going to jump back to my list view. So let's get into the group thing here real quick because I want to make sure we show that. The reason that we build up to this is because, whoopsie, where'd it go? There it is. Because if you do a group by override, you have to do the item override. That's the only way that you can get all of those pieces in there. So again, the default way is this, which works for some use cases. It also works like I'd explained way at the beginning. If I was doing something like this, I might build 3 web parts out. If it was a status type of list where I have static categories and say not completed, completed, and whatever another one would be, I can build 3 web parts. And I can say, all right, for my completed items, show these fields. For my not completed items, show these fields. And I can make it pretty clean, okay? But if it's something that's got a lot of values in it, like date, I'm not going to build a view per date. That would be stupid. So I need to use group by. The downside is we get those terrible headers. No control over them whatsoever. So using the override, I can now go in and I can build something, again, pardon my lack of design skills, but what we got right down to, though, is the fact that I've got my header with the information that I want in the format that I want. I can make it clickable if I want. I can do all kinds of great stuff in there. But now I've got a cleaner view than that by doing a group override. Okay? So let's go look at that code real quick. And then we'll almost get you on the road here. So again, up in the part where you're doing the overrides, I've got a group override now. I've got my item override like I had before, and I've got my header override like I had before. The item, I'm pretty sure that's literally exactly the same as the last example we showed. The group, and this is just scraping the surface, all I'm doing right now is displaying the value of that group name. So if it was a category field, it's going to display that particular category in that lookup. So the reason I'm giving you templates is because figuring this stuff out is a pain in the butt. So hopefully you'll be able to take this and know that you're going to get that title, right? So now I can put that out there. I'm going to play around some more and see what other things I can gather, like the number of items that are in it, like we have in the traditional view. I still want to know what that variable is so I can display it if I want to. But I want to display it how I want to instead of the way they tell us to. So, but this string right here will get you what you had on that example. So it'll show you the title that you have. You can wrap your own div, bold, whatever you want around it. Yeah.
Because then you could render a list actually, which is the summary.
Exactly.
So no items in it at all.
Yep. Yep. So that's and then I'm sure this, like the sum is out there too if you've got it, if you've got them summed up, all that kind of stuff. So I'm sure it's there. I just haven't dug in far enough to get it yet. But as soon as I have that, I'll add those to the templates and the documentation for it. And I'm going to use this. No one's going to use this? Come on. All right, that's better. I'm like, come on. I spent all afternoon figuring this out. All right, so that's the one that's been bugging me for the longest time. All right. I think that's all for my example. So let's get through the rest of the junk here. All right. So those are the basics. Once you've got those templates and you can start building things out, the next steps or the places that you can go to continue to build on that is play a little bit more with HTML so you can understand what you can do with that. Understand how CSS works. What you might end up doing, and this is another down the road thing that I could spend time on, is building out an override that is going to use CSS tags so that you can put that same override on multiple pages and have consistent branding through your sites. So it's just embedded in the HTML, so there's no reason we couldn't do that. We don't have an example for that. The more JavaScript that you know, the more powerful this is. So those of you that went to those sessions earlier, Usually it takes about 5 minutes into those sessions before the developers look at it and go, holy cow, this is just another way that I can get in there and build some really, really cool stuff. Because I could get in there, and if you wanted to, you could be doing some CSOM, some REST. You could basically be building an entire app using this as a way to expose that data. Again, way beyond what we're talking about, because you guys are supposed to be IW people. All right, power users. Conditional formatting, I didn't have a sample for that, but I will very shortly. It's just a little bit more complex. I didn't have time to get that one pulled together. Some of the other things that you'll see too are pre-render and post-render. When you saw the code where I was saying I want to override the field or override the item, override the group, pre-render and post-render are, I actually have those in a couple of examples, but there are other ones you can use to manipulate the data. Again, you're not changing the data that's in the database or in the list. You're changing the way that it's being displayed. So you need to use those a little bit, but again, they get into the more complicated solutions. I mentioned earlier I'll have some other templates coming out pretty quick. The conditional formatting, removing the link from the lookup, and then I also want to have that where I can replace that link with one that goes to a filtered list, rather than the link that goes back to the item, which is essentially useless. So those are some templates. You talk to me later, so I can look at her date one. And if you guys think of other ones, I would love to dig into some other examples. So by all means, let me know.
The only other one that I have to confess I went and got code and nicked it and didn't even look at it really, was you put a document library Webpart onto a page and the user's there to use folders, and you go into the folder, you have no idea you're in a folder.
You mean like if you dropped it on the home page and there's no navigation to get back up?
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, yeah, if you drop it into a page, when you're on thing, and I've got the code, I looked at it and went, yeah. Let's see if it works. Oh, good, it works. I don't have to change it. But it gives you a route and gives you the breadcrumb trail.
That sounds like a great use case for CSR.
Yeah, there you go.
All right, I like that.
I keep giving you ideas. I'll keep writing.
Yeah, I'm gonna make sure you send me emails. All right. So this is more just to have in the presentation so that you've got it as reference. These are the other two guys that did presentations on CSR related topics. Both fantastic presentations and resources. Martin's been doing CSR stuff for quite a while. He is much more on the developer side, so most of the time you're going to see him doing examples in Visual Studio and doing some, I'm going to roll out a list template and that kind of stuff, which is fantastic. It's just a different use case that I'm generally targeting, but awesome stuff. Todd, finally I convinced him to get into CSR stuff here within the last year, so now he's going crazy with it, which is awesome because he's insane. So he's got a couple of good sessions there. References, and I'll show you one here in a second. I just built a page yesterday with all of my CSR posts. I have all but a couple of the templates out there now, and I'll get the rest of them out there soon. And then links to those other guys' posts as well. So I'll show you that here in a second. And then I mentioned the JS linking targeting web parts. This is a link to that. Looks like I'll just leave it up so you guys can take your pictures. Has everyone got it? Yeah, this is it's not in there now. I'm going to get him the updated slides this afternoon.
And my fat blog, Paul Hunt, he's probably got some as well.
The what?
I'm sure his blog's called My Fat Blog.
Sure.
It's the blog of an overweight SharePoint addict, so I think that's my fat blog.
Oh, yes, that's actually, that's Paul.
Yeah.
Paul Hunt. Yeah, took me a second. Don't get enough sleep going to those parties at night. All right, where is it? There it is. So my blog is ugly, and it's going to change the way it looks right now. But I've got a link at the top, JS Link and CSR, and it's got all this stuff on it. So it's got all of the posts that I've done on JS Link and CSR related stuff. It's got the templates, and I'll add there's I think 3 or 4 that I don't have on there yet, but I'll add them on. It's got some presentations. So if you need to go backwards and look at some of the core stuff, I actually did a presentation back at the last 2 SharePoint conferences on the same topic where we were really digging down into the basics and stepping through those step by step. So those recordings are out there if you're interested in that. And then you've got Martin Hatch, Paul Hunt, and Stefan's blog posts out there that you can get grab links to. All right. Ooh, that's pretty darn close, isn't it? All right. Any questions? All right. You guys going to go back and use some of the stuff you learned?
Yep.
Yes, that's what I like to hear. And if you have ideas, I can give you my card. You'll have my blog address. Love to hear from you in ways that you're using this stuff. And if you run into things or need more good examples to work on, I'm all for that. Thanks for coming. I appreciate it. Thanks for sticking around to the last thing.